The sun shone brightly in our small town, reflecting off the windows of the elementary school. It was an ordinary day, but there was something in the air that felt different. I, Sarah, the new fourth-grade teacher, was still getting used to the routine and the curious faces that filled the classrooms. During recess, the children's voices echoed across the playground, filled with laughter and whispers. But that afternoon, something caught my attention. A group of students had gathered in a corner under the shade of a tree, their restless expressions revealing that they were involved in a secret conversation. With my curiosity piqued, I discreetly approached and positioned myself a little closer, trying to catch what they were saying. What I heard made my heart race. "I saw her again. I saw!" exclaimed Tommy, one of the most spirited boys in the class. His eyes sparkled with a mix of fear and excitement. "She was in the room during math class and she helped me with that tough problem." "Are you talking about the ghost teacher?" asked Lisa, a girl with curly hair and big eyes. "I think she likes us, you know. She just wants to help." "It's true, Mrs. Jenkins said she saw her once too," added another boy, his voice low, as if fearing someone might hear him. "On that stormy night, she was there, in the hallway, wearing a white dress." I felt a chill run down my spine upon hearing the words ghost teacher. The legend of Mrs. Montgomery, a former educator at our school who had tragically passed away, was something the children mentioned from time to time, but always as a joke. I never thought there was any truth to the story. But now, hearing those excited and terrified voices, I realized that curiosity and fear could intertwine in unexpected ways. I decided to join them. "Hey guys, what are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Tommy turned to me, his expression of joy now mixed with a hint of nervousness. "Sarah, have you heard about the ghost teacher? She appears in the hallway, asks questions about the lessons, and sometimes helps us study." "It's true, she helped Tommy with math," Lisa said eagerly. "No one believes us, but we know she's here." Considering what I heard, I sat down on the ground in front of them. "And how do you know it's Mrs. Montgomery?" I asked, intrigued. The reference to the former teacher was fascinating to me. I had read something about her in one of the files I found at the school, but I still didn't know many details. "Because she wears a white dress and has her hair up," Tommy replied, looking down as if recalling something. "And she always seems so sad." "She must be stuck here because of what happened," Lisa stated, with an almost solemn tone. "She loved her students very much." The conversation enveloped me in a way I didn't expect. The idea of a teacher who, even after death, still cared for her students was both touching and disturbing. I had always believed that life and death were definitive boundaries, but now, the possibility of a protective spirit began to take root in my mind. What could have caused such a strong connection between Mrs. Montgomery and her students? At that moment, the recess bell rang, and the children began to get up, still animatedly discussing the ghost teacher. The conversation followed me as I walked to the classroom, where the desks were arranged in circles and the pencils neatly lined up. What should I do with that information? Should I investigate further? Or would it be more prudent to ignore it and let the kids continue playing with their stories? As I organized the day's activities, the subject of the ghost teacher lingered in my mind. What made me hesitate was the memory of Mrs. Jenkins, one of the most experienced teachers at the school. She always had a logical explanation for everything, and if there was anything that could lend credibility to the story, it was her word. But at the same time, her skepticism could hinder the children's curiosity. During the break, I couldn't resist and went to the teacher's lounge. Conversations about lesson planning and grading were underway, but I couldn't help but bring up what I had heard. "Hey everyone, have you heard the stories about the ghost teacher?" I asked, trying to sound more casual than I really felt. The room fell silent for a moment. Mrs. Jenkins was the first to respond. "Those stories are just urban legends, Sarah. The kids have vivid imaginations, especially when it comes to ghosts." "But what if there's something more?" I insisted. "Tommy and other students really believe they saw something. And you even mentioned seeing her that stormy night." Mrs. Jenkins furrowed her brow, and I noticed a hint of concern in her gaze. "What I saw was just a shadow, perhaps a reflection of the light. I don't believe in ghosts, Sarah. Mrs. Montgomery was a wonderful teacher, but that doesn't mean her spirit is wandering around here." "But what if she's trying to communicate in some way?" I suggested, more to provoke discussion than from conviction. "The students need answers, and maybe this figure is here to protect them. Protect them from what? Asked another teacher, with a skeptical smile. From tough tests. Laughter in the room broke the tension, but I still felt there was something deeper there. Tommy's look, the excitement and fear in his voice, echoed in my mind. Was the story of Mrs. Montgomery just a childhood fantasy, or was there some truth to it all? I decided I needed to know more. It wasn't enough to hear the stories. I wanted to uncover the truth. Curiosity transformed into a silent mission, and the idea that Mrs. Montgomery might be communicating somehow began to fascinate me. By the end of the day, as the students dispersed, I went to the school library. The smell of old paper and polished wood welcomed me, and the shelves filled with books seemed to whisper secrets from the past. I needed to find any record that could help me understand more about Mrs. Montgomery. After a few hours of research, I found a dusty file with her name on it. I flipped through the yellowed pages, which contained old photos and testimonials from former students. Her passion for education was palpable, and the love letters from students revealed the impact she had on their lives. But one page caught my attention. It was a letter that seemed to have never been sent, torn in parts, but some words were still legible. I will always be with you, protecting you. What could have happened? Why didn't Mrs. Montgomery send this letter? My heart raced as the questions piled up in my mind. The sun had set, and the dim light of the library illuminated only the nearest corners, creating a dark and intriguing atmosphere. I decided I needed to learn more about Mrs. Montgomery and what really happened that fateful night. The story of the ghost teacher was just beginning to unfold, and I was determined to unravel it, even if it meant confronting the mysteries surrounding those hallways. After all, the truth could be stranger than fiction, and I was about to dive headfirst into this enigma. The classroom lights flickered softly, as if trying to convey a message to me. The air was charged, and a sense of electricity coursed down my spine. I couldn't shake the idea that Mrs. Montgomery, the teacher who had become a legend among the students, was somehow present. The mystery surrounding her intrigued me, and at the same time, frightened me. I decided I needed to understand more about her life, and about what had happened in that school so many years ago. With that determination, I descended the stairs leading to the school basement, a place that always had an air of mystery and abandonment. The light from my phone illuminated the path, revealing dust-covered walls and boxes stacked haphazardly. The smell of mildew. It was strong, but curiosity urged me to move forward. I needed to find something, some clue that connected me to that ghost teacher my students talked about so much. After a few minutes of searching, I spotted a particular box, covered by a thick layer of dust. The label was almost illegible, but I could make out the name, Mrs. Montgomery. My heart raced. With effort, I pulled the box out, making it creak as it moved. The sound echoed through the empty basement, and a shiver ran down my spine, but I was not willing to back down. I opened the box, and the sight that presented itself before me was a true treasure. Diaries, black and white photos, and yellowed documents. I began to leaf through the diaries and soon came across Mrs. Montgomery's delicate handwriting. The pages were filled with notes about her students, their hopes and dreams. She wrote with so much love and care that I could almost feel her warm presence through the words. In one passage, she described a class where she encouraged the students to express their emotions through art. Education goes beyond books and tests. It's about touching the hearts of children, she had written. The words resonated within me, and I realized that Mrs. Montgomery was not just a teacher, but a mentor who deeply cared about her students. As I continued reading, I found a passage that caught my attention. It was about a letter she had written, but never sent. What could have been so important that Mrs. Montgomery hesitated to deliver it? My heart raced again, and a wave of curiosity washed over me. What was in that letter? What did she want to say? I decided to search for the letter. The box was full of photos, and one of them caught my eye. It was an image of Mrs. Montgomery with a group of students, all smiling. There was something so pure in that photo, a happiness that shone through. I wondered what had happened to those students. Did they still remember her? After rummaging through the box, I finally found the letter. It was tucked between some yellowed sheets of paper. It was a bit hard to read, but I managed to decipher some words. She spoke of a special event being planned for the students, a surprise Mrs. Montgomery wanted to arrange on the day of her accident. I can hardly wait to see the joy on their faces, she wrote. A deep sadness washed over me as I realized she never had the chance to fulfill that dream. "What happened to you, Mrs. Montgomery?" I murmured to myself as I held the letter. The silence of the basement seemed to respond with a distant echo. Suddenly, a cold breeze passed by me, and the classroom lights began to flicker again. I looked around, feeling as though I was not alone. The air was charged with an inexplicable energy. I was not just reliving the past, I was connecting with it. The figure of the teacher described by the students seemed to become clearer in my mind. It was as if I could visualize Mrs. Montgomery in her classroom, surrounded by children, laughing and teaching with passion. "You still care about them, don't you?" I asked, as if she could hear me. I felt that somehow she was watching over me, that her spirit was still present, looking after her students and the school. I left the basement with the letter in hand, determined to learn more about Mrs. Montgomery's legacy and how I could honor her memory. As I walked down the hallways, the voices of the students echoed in my mind. The stories they told about the ghost teacher began to make sense. She was not just there as a haunting figure, she was a guardian, a gentle soul who still wished to protect and guide those she loved. "Sarah," I heard a voice call. It was Mrs. Jenkins, approaching with a concerned look. "Are you okay? What are you doing down here?" "I found some things about Mrs. Montgomery," I replied, showing her the letter. She had a plan for the students, something she never had the chance to carry out. Mrs. Jenkins looked at the letter with a surprised expression. "I always knew she was an amazing teacher, but I never knew she had such special plans. What do you think you'll do with it?" "I want to honor her memory. We need to do something that celebrates what she did for us and for her students. You know that many of the former students still live in town, right?" Mrs. Jenkins mentioned as she looked around the basement. "We could gather everyone and hold a tribute. That could be a way to bring back memories and show current students the impact she had." The idea began to take shape in my mind. An event in honor of Mrs. Montgomery could be the perfect way to connect the generations and celebrate her legacy. "Let's do it," I exclaimed excitedly. "We need a space, activities, something that involves the students." "I can help organize everything," Mrs. Jenkins said, equally excited. "Let's make this happen." As we discussed the details, excitement grew within me. I could imagine the students sharing stories, laughing, and remembering the teacher who had left an indelible mark on their lives. The event could not only honor Mrs. Montgomery's memory, but also create a safe space for students to express themselves and share their experiences. "And what about the letter?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, looking at me with curiosity. "What will you do with it?" "I want to read it during the event," I replied, already visualizing the moment. It will be a way to bring her voice back and show everyone how much she cared. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "That's going to be amazing." With the decision made, I returned to the classroom, my heart light and full of hope. As we organized everything, I couldn't help but think of Mrs. Montgomery. I felt her closer than ever, as if her presence was guiding me. The classroom lights flickered again, and a gentle breeze seemed to caress my face. "I'm coming, Mrs. Montgomery," I whispered, looking up at the ceiling. "We'll do this for you." And with that thought, a new chapter was about to be written, not only in the school's history, but also in the lives of all who loved Mrs. Montgomery. The lights continued to flicker, but now they were not a sign of fear. They were a confirmation that her love and memory still shone brightly. The day was already beginning to turn into night when I left the teacher's lounge, my heart still racing with the new discoveries about Mrs. Montgomery. The atmosphere in the school felt different, as if the air was charged with a restless electricity. Every step I took down the hallway echoed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, as if the school itself was trying to convey a message to me. I continued walking, and the first thing I noticed was the door to the 5th grade classroom. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently, as if someone was pushing it from inside. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity was stronger than fear. I approached and looked inside. "Hey, Sarah, did you see the ghost teacher?" Tommy's voice interrupted my thoughts. He was sitting in the front row, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Do you really believe she exists?" I asked, trying to maintain a skeptical tone, even though a part of me was intrigued. "Of course. She helped me with that math problem I couldn't solve. It was amazing," he said, gesturing with his hands. She showed me how to do it, and suddenly everything made sense. What do you mean, Tommy? Did you see the teacher helping you? I asked, crossing my arms. Yes, I was in class, and she appeared right next to me, whispering the answers. No one else saw her, but it was real. He seemed so convinced that I couldn't completely dismiss his words. And what did she look like? I asked, leaning in a bit more, intrigued. She was wearing an old all-white dress, and she had a pretty smile. But I couldn't see her face clearly. It was like she was a bit blurry. Tommy frowned, trying to remember. But her voice was soft. It was like she wanted me to learn. I hesitated. There was something very special in Tommy's words, something that made me think there was more to Mrs. Montgomery's figure than just a legend. Are you sure that was it? Was there anything else strange? Any doors that closed by themselves or lights flickering? No, but I heard others talking about hearing whispers in the halls, and once, when we were on break, I saw something in the classroom window. It looked like a shadow. He said, looking around as if he were afraid someone might hear him. A shadow? I asked, trying to stay calm, but my heart was racing. And what do you think it was? I don't know, but it seems like she wants to help us. It's like she's watching over us. The conviction in his voice was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a chill in my stomach. Maybe you're right, Tommy, but we need to be careful. Stories can be misleading. I tried to sound rational, but the truth was that I was starting to wonder if there was indeed something deeper going on. Soon, the bell rang and the students began to get up, gathering their things. This made me think about the idea of organizing a QA session. They had so much to share, and I needed to understand more about this ghost teacher. Tommy, what do you think about us doing an activity where everyone can share their experiences about the ghost teacher? I suggested, trying to sound enthusiastic. That would be amazing, Sarah. We could do a kind of story circle, he exclaimed, excited. Great. I'll talk to Mrs. Jenkins and see what we can do. Let's make this happen in the next class, okay? As I spoke, a shadow at the end of the hallway caught my attention. I looked quickly, but there was nothing there, just the white walls and the linoleum floor. Sarah? Tommy's voice brought me back to reality. You look pale. What's wrong? Oh, I just thought I saw something. It must be my imagination. I smiled, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was following me. Come on, we need to get ready for class. With the students dispersing, I returned to the teacher's lounge and looked for Mrs. Jenkins. I found her in the supply room, organizing some books. Mrs. Jenkins, do you have a moment? Of course, Sarah. What do you need? She asked, smiling. I was thinking about organizing a session where the students can share their experiences about the ghost teacher. Tommy told me some interesting things, and I think it could be a good opportunity for them to express themselves and maybe even understand more about what they're feeling. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Do you really believe there's something supernatural happening here? I don't know. I want to believe they're just being creative. But what if there's something more? What did you see that stormy night? The question slipped out before I could stop it. She hesitated, looking down for a moment. I did see a figure, yes. But I can't say it was Mrs. Montgomery. It could have just been the light reflecting in a strange way. But what if it's not? What if she really is here, trying to communicate with the students? My voice trembled with anxiety. We need to understand what she wants. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath as if preparing for a revelation. If you really think it's worth it, then I'm with you. We can do this QA session. But be careful, Sarah. Sometimes what we're looking for might not be what we want to find. Those words echoed in my mind as I left the teacher's lounge. Fear and excitement mixed within me like a whirlwind. What was really happening in that school? What did Mrs. Montgomery want? A part of me wanted to find out, while the other part was terrified that the truth could be darker than I imagined. During the night, while I was reviewing my plans for the activity, I couldn't help but think about everything I had learned so far about Mrs. Montgomery. The old journals and photos I found in the school basement felt so distant, and yet so close. It was as if each sheet of paper was loaded with unresolved emotions. I tried to focus on something else, but the image of the shadow at the door and the whispers I had heard in the hallways wouldn't leave my mind. It was time to face the truth. I needed to know what Mrs. Montgomery really wanted and what was happening with the students. The next morning, I prepared the classroom, arranging the chairs in a circle, creating an open space for the students to talk. My heart raced as I imagined what they might reveal. What more did they have to say about the ghost teacher? When the students began to enter, I noticed that the atmosphere was different. There was an air of expectation, as if everyone were aware that something important was about to happen. Tommy was the first to sit down and looked at me with an encouraging smile. "Are you ready, Sarah?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. "I'm ready, Tommy. Let's hear what everyone has to say," I replied, trying to convey confidence. Once the students settled in, I began to explain the activity. "Today, we're going to come together and share our experiences about Mrs. Montgomery. I want everyone to feel comfortable telling their stories, even if they seem strange." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was as if the school itself was holding its breath. "Who would like to start?" I asked, looking around. A girl named Lisa raised her hand. I saw the ghost teacher during recess. She was near the swing, looking at me. I was alone and got scared, but then I felt like she wanted to tell me something. "And what do you think that was?" I asked, intrigued. "I don't know, but I couldn't stop thinking about her afterward." She looked confused, but at the same time, there was determination in her eyes. Other students began to share their experiences, and with each account, I felt the connection to Mrs. Montgomery grow stronger. It was as if she were there, listening and caring for each of them. "I'd like to ask for her help in math too," another student chimed in, making everyone laugh. "She helped me understand history, and it was amazing," another continued, and thus the conversation flowed. As the students shared, a sense of peace began to settle in the room. It felt as if Mrs. Montgomery was truly present, listening to their voices and feeling loved. For a moment, I felt that everything was right. But then, a cold draft swept through the room, causing a shiver. The classroom was in tense silence as I prepared for the QA session with the students. All eyes were on me, and the anticipation in the air was palpable. The children, eager and intrigued, had shared their experiences with the ghost teacher, but now it was my turn to lead the conversation and try to understand what that presence wanted to tell us. "I'm not exactly sure where to start," I said, trying to break the ice. "But let's talk about the teacher you saw. What do you think she wants?" A wave of hands shot up. The first to speak was Clara, a girl with curly hair and bright eyes. "She said she wanted to help with history homework. I couldn't understand why the American Revolution was so important, and she explained everything to me. She helped me with math, too," added Lucas, a skinny boy with glasses. "I was so confused about fractions, and suddenly I saw her at my desk, showing me how to do it. It was incredible." I was impressed by the fervor with which they spoke. "So, do you think she's trying to send a message? Something she wants to teach us?" "Yes," they shouted in unison, their voices echoing through the room. One of the boys, Tommy, who had been one of the first to report the sighting, stood up and said, "I think she wants us to know that she cares about us. She's here to help." Hearing this, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if those students were connected to something much bigger than us. I remembered the letter I had found in the basement, the one Mrs. Montgomery never had the chance to send. What could be so important that she wanted to share? What could have changed their fate on that fateful day? "If she were here right now, what do you think she would say?" I asked, curious. The room was filled with reflective silence. After a few moments, Anna, a shy girl who rarely spoke in public, hesitantly raised her hand. "I think she would say that we should always do our best and never give up, even when things get tough." "That makes sense," I said, nodding. "And do you think she would be proud of you?" "Yes," Lucas replied enthusiastically. "She always encouraged us." The conversation continued, and I noticed how Mrs. Montgomery's presence was leading the children to a place of comfort and safety. It was as if she were there, listening to everything we said. The atmosphere was charged with energy and emotion, and I couldn't help but wonder if the figure they saw really cared for them as they believed. But at the same time, I felt a bit lost. What could I do to help? Suddenly, the idea of reading the letter aloud seemed like a good way to connect all of us with Mrs. Montgomery's spirit. What if I read the letter I found? It might have something important to tell us, I suggested. The students looked at each other and excitement grew. "Yes, do it!" they shouted. I took the letter I had saved feeling the yellowed paper under my fingers. My thoughts were jumbled as I unrolled it, but the desire to understand Mrs. Montgomery's message was stronger. I looked at the hopeful faces in front of me and took a deep breath. All right, here goes. I began to read, and each word seemed to come alive. Dear students, I started, the old elegant handwriting unfolding in my mind. If you are reading this, it's because I am no longer with you. I never thought my time here would end so suddenly. What I want most is for you to never stop believing in yourselves and to always seek knowledge. There was a surprise planned for you, something that made me very excited. As I read, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A cold breeze swept through the space, making the students' hair stand on end. I paused, looking around, and noticed that everyone was pale and wide-eyed. Did you feel that too? Clara whispered, trembling. Yes, I murmured, trying to stay calm. It seems Mrs. Montgomery really is here with us. Continuing to read, I found the part that spoke about the surprise. I planned a special day for each of you, filled with activities and fun. A day when you could learn and grow together, like a true family. I want you to know that, even when I am no longer physically with you, I will always be in your hearts. The room fell into absolute silence as the words echoed. The connection we were forming with Mrs. Montgomery felt tangible, almost as if an invisible presence was surrounding us. When I finished reading, the children were in a state of enchantment. So Mrs. Montgomery wanted to do something special for us? Lucas asked, his eyes shining. Yes, it seems so, I replied, trying to grasp what that meant. She wanted to celebrate learning and the bond between you. We can do that, Tommy suggested, a radiant smile on his face. Let's do the surprise she planned. I felt my heart warm with the idea. Not only were the students connecting with the memory of their teacher, but they were also taking the initiative to honor her legacy. That's a great idea, Tommy. How about we organize a special day to honor Mrs. Montgomery? We can do activities she would have liked. The children began to get excited, talking all at once, each giving ideas on what we could do. Painting, games, a little theater performance. The suggestions flowed, and I could hardly keep up. It was as if Mrs. Montgomery were there, encouraging them to express themselves and have fun. We could make a mural with pictures and memories of her, Clara said. That way, everyone can see how much she loved us. The excitement took over the room, and I realized that amid all this there was an opportunity not only to honor Mrs. Montgomery's memory, but also to strengthen the bonds between the children. They were coming together around the same purpose, and it was beautiful to see. I'll help you organize everything, I promised, smiling. Let's plan an event that Mrs. Montgomery would have loved. It can be a way for us to thank her for everything she did for us. Time flew by as we discussed ideas. When the session finally came to an end, I felt renewed. The children left the room with smiles on their faces, and I knew we had created something special. But at the same time, a sense of anxiety washed over me. The presence of Mrs. Montgomery was undeniable, and I couldn't help but wonder what she really wanted to tell us. As I organized the room, a cold breeze swept through again, and the lights began to flicker. I looked around, and the feeling of being watched returned. What else did Mrs. Montgomery want to share? The letter had opened a path, but there was still much mystery to unravel. I decided I needed to investigate more about who she was, beyond what I had already read. Curiosity consumed me, and as a teacher, I had always believed that knowledge is the key to understanding the unknown. I remembered the box of documents I had found in the basement. There were more diaries and photos that could help me understand Mrs. Montgomery and her wishes better. I'm going to the basement now, I murmured to myself, determined. I need to discover more about you, Mrs. Montgomery. I walked through the silent hallways of the school, the sound of my footsteps echoing around me. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to dance around me. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated for a moment. The darkness below seemed both inviting and frightening at the same time. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, turning on the light. The basement was in disarray, and the box I had found was exactly where I left it. I began rummaging through the documents, trying to find something that could give me clues about Mrs. Montgomery's life. Among the yellowed papers, I found pictures of students, thank you letters, and some newspaper clippings that spoke of her dedication to teaching. One photo caught my attention. It was a group of children smiling alongside Mrs. Montgomery, who seemed so full of life. Her gaze was kind and affectionate, and I wondered what had happened to those little faces that were now adults. What did Mrs. I was sitting at the teacher's lounge table, the unsent letter from Mrs. Montgomery still in hand, when a wave of determination washed over me. The words written with such care and expectation pulsed in my mind, mixing with the cold air that was starting to take over the room. She wanted her students to know they were special, I thought, and that idea ignited a flame within me. I needed to honor her memory. I needed to do something that would unite the school and bring forth the legacy of love that teacher had left behind. I suddenly stood up, causing the metal chairs to scrape against the floor. I looked around and saw Mrs. Jenkins, who was engrossed in her notes. "Mrs. Jenkins," I called out, with an enthusiasm that made my heart race. "What if we organized an event in honor of Mrs. Montgomery? Something that involved all the students and alumni. We could share stories, memories, have a celebration of everything she meant to us." Mrs. Jenkins looked up, her blue eyes widening. "That's a wonderful idea, Sarah. Mrs. Montgomery deserves to be remembered. She was an amazing teacher and, from what I've heard, very loved." Excitement grew inside me. I could see it all forming in my mind. Colorful banners, decorated tables, maybe even a musical presentation where the students could sing songs that Mrs. Montgomery loved. "Let's do it," I said, almost to myself, as I began jotting down quick notes on what we would need. In the days that followed, the school became a frenzy of activity. I invited all the students to participate and share their stories about Mrs. Montgomery. I heard laughter and whispers in the hallways as the children gathered in groups sharing their memories. The energy was in the air, palpable and vibrant. One afternoon, while arranging the chairs in the gym, an inexplicable sensation took over me, as if someone was watching me. I looked around, but there was no one, just the shadows of the walls reflected by the sunlight coming through the windows. "It's just nerves," I told myself, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something there, something that made me feel Mrs. Montgomery's presence, as if she were encouraging me to move forward. On the day of the event, anxiety was high. The sky was covered with thick clouds and a light drizzle began to fall. "I think Mrs. Montgomery is reminding us that she is here," I commented to Mrs. Jenkins as we set up the stage. She smiled. "Yes, perhaps she is blessing us with her presence." Students began to arrive, each bringing a piece of paper with their stories written down. The tables were filled with drawings, old photos, and objects that represented Mrs. Montgomery. I looked at the mural the students had created, filled with messages and memories. I felt my heart tighten with the beauty of those memories. The love everyone felt for her was palpable. When the event began, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. A group of students took the stage and began to tell their stories. I remember Tommy, one of the students who had talked about the ghost teacher. "Mrs. Montgomery helped me with my reading. I was so nervous, but she was always there, encouraging me," he said, his eyes shining. The audience murmured in agreement, and I realized that each person there had a unique connection to that extraordinary woman. Throughout the night, there were many stories, laughter, and a few tears. Each account seemed to bring Mrs. Montgomery closer to us. During a break, while everyone was serving themselves cake and soda, I went to the mural to read the messages that the students had written. Left. Among the affectionate words, one phrase caught my attention. "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery, for helping me believe in myself." That phrase resonated in my heart. She not only taught, she inspired. As I watched the students talking and sharing their memories, a sudden vision struck me. Mrs. Montgomery, in her long skirt and lace blouse, smiling and waving at me. It was so vivid that I could almost feel her warmth. "You are doing the right thing, Sarah," she seemed to be saying to me. Wrapped in a soft light, her presence was comforting and encouraging. I knew she was there somehow. The rain started to fall harder outside, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The sound was almost musical, a perfect accompaniment to the celebration happening inside the school. The weather, though stormy, only added a layer of magic to the event. At that moment, I realized that Mrs. Montgomery was present not only in spirit, but in every story shared, in every laugh, and in every tear. As the ceremony was nearing its end, something unexpected happened. One of the students, Lucas, who had always been a bit more reserved, stood up and asked to speak. Everyone turned to him, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to expect. "I have a story," he began, his voice trembling but steady. "Mrs. Montgomery helped me a lot, but there was also something I never told." Silence fell over the gymnasium. "What do you mean, Lucas?" I asked, encouraging him to continue. "I was in the classroom on the day of the accident," he said, and a murmur ran through the crowd. "I didn't know she was planning a surprise for us. I was sick and couldn't go to class that day. When I heard what happened, I kept wondering if I could have done something to help her. I feel like she is still here, trying to warn us about something." The tension rose, and a sense of anticipation hung in the air. "What do you think she is trying to tell us?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I don't know," Lucas replied, looking down, "but I feel like she wants us all to know that she loves us and that we should always remember her, and that we should keep learning, no matter what happens." At that moment, a wave of emotion washed over me. Lucas's words touched everyone, and I could see tears in the eyes of some teachers and students. It was as if Mrs. Montgomery was bringing us together, uniting our hearts for a single purpose: to honor her legacy. When Lucas finished speaking, a wave of applause erupted. I felt emotional and grateful. The event was more than a tribute. It was a celebration of life, education, and the love that transcends even death. Mrs. Montgomery had become an indelible part of our lives, and what she represented was now clearer than ever. As the event came to an end, I looked at the faces of the students and teachers around me. Each of them carried a spark of hope and love, a light that would never go out. And in that moment, I knew that Mrs. Montgomery's presence would continue to live in our hearts, in every lesson we taught, in every student we helped to grow. The night was just beginning, and as I looked out the window, the storm seemed to be calming down. The sky was starting to clear, and the stars began to slowly appear. It was as if the universe was reflecting what was happening inside the school. Mrs. Montgomery had left us a clear message. Love never dies. It transforms and lives through us. I smiled, feeling a deep peace. Mrs. Montgomery's legacy was not just a memory. It was a light that would continue to guide our lives. And as the students dispersed, laughing and talking about their stories, I knew that somehow she would always be with us. The day of the event finally arrived, and I could hardly contain the anxiety pulsing inside me. The school was filled with an atmosphere of expectation, even though the storm outside threatened to ruin everything. The dark, heavy-laden clouds gathered in the sky, reflecting the intensity of the emotions I felt. The students, some nervous, others excited, gathered in the auditorium, where everything would take place. It was a space that, despite its worn walls, carried so many memories, and now it would be the stage for a tribute that I hoped would bring peace not only to me, but also to the spirit of Mrs. Montgomery. "Sarah!" A voice interrupted my thoughts. It was Tommy, the boy who had talked about seeing the ghost teacher. He was with a group of classmates, all with expressions of anticipation. "Do you think she will show up again?" "I hope so, Tommy. But more importantly, we need to show how much Mrs. Montgomery meant to us," I replied, trying to soothe the unease I felt. The storm began to roar outside, but inside the auditorium, the atmosphere was almost magical. The lights were softly lit, and a large banner made by the students, with Mrs. Montgomery's name, was hung behind the stage. Everyone settled into their seats, and the murmur of voices turned into a respectful silence as I stepped onto the stage. "Good evening, everyone," I began, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "Today we are here to celebrate the life of Mrs. Montgomery, a teacher who left a profound legacy in each of us." Hearing the laughter and whispers of shared memories, I recalled how the students had engaged in organizing the event. Each had contributed stories, drawings, and even songs that spoke about Mrs. Montgomery. It was as if she was guiding us, even if we were not aware of it. The connection everyone felt was palpable, as if the air was charged with love and longing. As the stories were told, the storm outside intensified. Lightning illuminated the auditorium in brief flashes, and the rain drummed against the windows, creating an engaging soundtrack for the ceremony. One of the students, Lucas, took the stage and began to share how Mrs. Montgomery helped him overcome his difficulty with reading. "I remember how she always said I was capable, even when I thought I wasn't," Lucas said, his voice trembling but steady. "She taught me that reading is like flying, and that I could go anywhere I wanted." The audience applauded, and I felt emotional. Lucas's words resonated with me, reflecting what I also felt about Mrs. Montgomery's impact. A part of me was convinced that somehow she was there, listening to every word. After several stories, I decided it was time to read the letter I had found. The room was enveloped in a reverent silence as I opened the aged envelope. Mrs. Montgomery's words, written with such care, echoed in my mind. As I began to read aloud, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Dear students," I began, my voice firm but a bit emotional. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, but my love for you will never fade." At that moment, the lights began to flicker. A murmur of concern spread through the room, but I continued, determined not to let anything interrupt this sacred moment. "I always wanted you to know how special each of you is to me." The atmosphere was charged, and the storm outside seemed to intensify the connection we felt. When I finished reading, a profound silence enveloped the auditorium as if time itself had stopped. But then, something unexpected happened. A cold breeze swept through the space and the lights went out completely, plunging everyone into darkness. A scream echoed among the students, and I immediately searched for the source of the voice, but I couldn't see anything. My heart raced in my chest and a sense of panic began to spread. Then, amid the darkness, a soft light began to glow. It was a white light, almost ethereal, emanating from a corner of the auditorium. All eyes turned to it, and the panic quickly transformed into curiosity. "Look!" someone shouted, and everyone leaned in to see the source of the light. I turned too, and what I saw left me speechless. The light seemed to dance in the air, forming a familiar figure. It was Mrs. Montgomery. Her silhouette was translucent, but the smile on her face was unmistakable. The figure appeared to float, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "She's here," Tommy whispered, his eyes wide with astonishment and joy. Mrs. Montgomery's figure raised her hand as if inviting us to come closer. I felt an irresistible urge to move forward. With a hesitant step, I walked toward the light, soon realizing I wasn't alone. The students, intrigued and amazed, began to move toward her as well. "You are so special," Mrs. Montgomery's voice echoed, soft as the wind. It wasn't a voice heard with ears, but something felt in the heart. "Never forget the love we have for each other. It will always remain." Tears streamed down my face as I listened to those words. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, and I felt all the sadness and longing we carried slowly dissipating, replaced by a comforting warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery," I managed to say, my voice choked. "Thank you for everything you did for us." The figure smiled even more, and I felt a wave of energy coursing through my body. It was not just a goodbye. It was a promise that she would always be with us. In an instant, the light began to fade, and Mrs. Montgomery's figure started to disappear slowly, as if she were returning to where she came from. "You are my students, always," she said, her voice echoing softly until it finally fell silent. The light went out, and darkness took over the auditorium once again. However, instead of fear, there was a feeling of peace. The lights came back on, and everyone was silent, absorbing what we had just experienced. I looked around and saw tears, but also smiles. The love and connection that Mrs. Montgomery had created among us were stronger than ever. She was here," someone murmured, and soon applause began. I joined in the applause, feeling my heart overflow. It was a celebration not only of Mrs. Montgomery's life, but also of the new understanding we all had about the love and connection that united us. As the ceremony drew to a close, a new idea began to take shape in my mind. Mrs. Montgomery's legacy shouldn't end there. I wanted her memory to be honored in a way that transcended that event. As I looked at the emotional faces of my classmates, I realized the real work was just beginning. "I want all of us to continue sharing Mrs. Montgomery's stories," I declared, still filled with emotion. "Let's create a permanent mural at school, where everyone can leave their memories, drawings, and messages about the impact she had on our lives." The students began to applaud again, and a sense of excitement started to spread through the room. It was as if Mrs. Montgomery were urging us to carry on her legacy of love and teaching. And so, as the storm outside began to calm, I knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey, where the love and memory of Mrs. Montgomery would live on forever in our hearts and in our school.